Adam Sloan had never been particularly sentimental about the structures he built. Concrete, steel, fiber optics, transit loops, each was just a part of the job, a puzzle to solve. But this neighborhood, this sleepy cul-de-sac on the edge of Westbridge Heights, was different. 10 years ago, before any of the homes were even penciled into the city's plans, he stood over these hills with a GPS tablet and drafted the early survey maps that would become the backbone of the area's infrastructure. He wasn't a visionary, not in the poetic sense, but he was methodical, precise, and thorough, traits that made him invaluable on multi-phase logistics projects. When the city had needed someone to optimize the southern delivery grid, they'd called Adam. When the county had no idea how to reroute graywater overflow through a high-density residential slope without disrupting traffic or tearing up streets, Adam ran the first successful simulations. He didn't think of it as ownership, but there was a quiet pride in knowing that when trucks rolled in and families moved into prefabbed pastel homes with clean sidewalks and city-approved trees, they were driving on his calculations, his angles, his algorithms. That was years ago. The contracts dried up after corporate buyout. The consulting firm pivoted to AI modeling, and Adam, already burned out from bureaucratic delays and watching cost-cutting ruin careful design, had bowed out. With a spinal disc injury that made prolonged sitting unbearable and his patience for meetings even shorter, he'd chosen retreat over reinvention. He had enough savings and city pensions to live quietly, and so he returned, almost poetically, to the exact neighborhood he'd helped design, buying one of the few houses with an elevated lot and a wide porch that overlooked the grid lines he once drew on screen. It was modest, a single-story home tucked between two larger properties, but the elevation and layout were efficient, compact, and familiar. He had, after all, designed the drainage and emergency access paths for this zone himself. 3 months after moving in, he added the ramp. The decision wasn't aesthetic nor symbolic. It was pure function. The incline from his driveway to the front steps was sharp, and while Adam could still walk without assistance, his balance was unreliable on wet mornings or at dusk. The neurologist had called it a vestibular disorder, possibly trauma-induced. The word degenerative had been used casually, almost clinically as if it were just another line on a chart. Adam didn't dramatize it, he just adjusted. The ramp he built was solid, industrial aluminum, modular, with non-slip grating and bolted rails. It was installed to code under city permit, and with help from 2 professionals he trusted. It didn't disrupt the sidewalk, didn't block the view from the street, and didn't encroach on anyone's property lines. At first, no one said anything. A few passing glances, maybe a sideways look from the woman across the street with the white SUV and an obsession with identical flower pots, but otherwise, nothing. The neighborhood, like many others stitched together by developers, operated under a property association, but Adam paid little attention to its social structure. He'd lived under 6 boards over the years, some petty, some passive, and expected this one to be no different. He was wrong. The first letter arrived tucked into his mailbox, printed on thick paper with a pale blue header, reading, Community Aesthetic Advisory. The language was polite, but passive-aggressive in that practiced way bureaucrats used when disguising control as consensus. Dear Mr. Sloan, it has come to our attention that a non-standard modification has been made to the facade of your property. The word ramp wasn't used until the second paragraph, and even then it was framed as a deviation from approved entrance design protocols, potentially in conflict with neighborhood symmetry guidelines. The letter ended with a request, not an order, but not really optional either, to remove the installation or apply for retroactive visual compliance assessment. Adam read it twice, checked the envelope for a signature, there was none, then set it aside. He didn't reply. Instead, he reviewed the city permit he'd secured before installation. It was valid. The ramp met all zoning and accessibility requirements. So he filed the letter away, assuming it was the result of a misguided neighbor with too much free time. That was a mistake. The second letter arrived a week later, this time on different letterhead, Residential Design Integrity Committee. But clearly from the same source. The tone had shifted. Now it was about upholding the character of the street and the importance of a uniform streetscape. There was no mention of safety or function or health. Instead, it framed the issue as a matter of visual harmony. Attached was a photo of Adam's house taken from the sidewalk, with the ramp circled in red. There was a line in bold. Deadline for voluntary removal. Friday, 5 p.m. He went outside that afternoon and looked at his property through the same lens they must have used, literally and metaphorically. It didn't match the other houses, true. His porch didn't have the same ornamental columns or matching brick planters. His ramp was metal, not wood, and stood out against the beige tones that dominated the block. But it wasn't ugly. It was functional, and most importantly, it was necessary. That evening, he typed a calm but direct email to the address listed on the notice, attaching copies of his permit and medical documents, including the signed diagnosis letter from his neurologist. The response, when it came, was cold. "We appreciate your documentation, but medical needs do not exempt properties from visual compliance standards set forth by the Neighborhood Council." That was when he first heard her name, Karen Belrose, chair of the Visual Harmony Subcommittee, recently elected, according to her signature block, by unanimous neighborhood vote. He'd never met her in person, but now she had a presence in his inbox and, as he soon discovered, in the minds of his neighbors. Karen lived 2 houses down, in the cream-colored ranch with the matching rose trellises and solar-powered yard lights. She had a clipboard when she walked her dog, a golden doodle named Muffin, and often stopped at different driveways to make notes. One afternoon, Adam spotted her pointing at his ramp while speaking to a man trimming hedges across the street. Her hands moved as she spoke, expressive, precise, like a director giving stage notes. Things escalated. By the end of the month, Adam had received 3 additional notices, each with sterner language, each citing vague violations and threatening escalating daily fines for non-compliance. No city codes were referenced. No official inspection had occurred. Just letters from a self-appointed committee whose only authority came from the inertia of collective silence. Most of the neighbors, he assumed, had no idea these rules were even being enforced. Or worse, they agreed. Adam didn't yell. He didn't stage a protest. Instead, he requested a formal hearing with the association, providing legal evidence of the ramp's approval. The request was ignored. Then, 2 days before the supposed removal deadline, a notice appeared taped to his front door. Work order scheduled. Unauthorized ramp to be removed at homeowner's expense. That night, Adam sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his laptop. He wasn't angry. He was calculating. He'd spent years building systems designed to endure stress, pressure, collapse. He understood how networks failed, not with explosions, but through small, tolerated violations of integrity. This wasn't about a ramp. This was about control. He realized then, the same structures he once built to serve people were now being used to contain them. He reached for his old city maps, the ones he never threw away. Somewhere beneath this cul-de-sac, beneath Karen's roses and decorative solar lights, ran a system of access routes and bypass grids that Adam himself had engineered. And if they thought he'd be easy to corner, they had forgotten something vital. He built this place. Adam didn't sleep the night the removal notice appeared. He didn't pace or stew or call anyone. Instead, he did what he'd done for decades when a system was collapsing under its own contradictions. He mapped the terrain. Not the literal street, though he had dozens of files with cross-referenced satellite overlays and underground conduit maps from back when this neighborhood was just lines on a zoning request. No, this terrain was behavioral, human, predictable, yet always riddled with subtle blind spots. He noted the key players, tracked the escalation timeline, the language in each letter and how it had shifted from suggestion to directive, how each signature slowly disappeared and was replaced by collective phrases like the committee or per board policy. It wasn't just the ramp. It was his presence, or more specifically, his refusal to assimilate quietly. Karen Belrose had expected the kind of neighbor who would apologize for disrupting the view and remove the ramp in the name of keeping the peace. Instead, she'd gotten a man who understood leverage better than most. The morning after the final notice, a white van with a logo that read Property Enhancement and Compliance parked across the street at 8:03 a.m. Two men in reflective vests stepped out, one carrying a clipboard, the other with a bright orange impact drill slung at his side like a badge. Adam watched them from his kitchen window, sipping coffee with one hand, the other resting on the thick envelope of paperwork he'd compiled. By 8:15, they approached his gate, scanned the address, and spoke quietly. One gestured toward the ramp. Adam walked out the front door before they could make contact. He was polite, calm. He didn't raise his voice. He handed them both printed copies of the city permit and reminded them that any unpermitted action on his property would be classified as trespassing and destruction of ADA-compliant infrastructure. The man with the clipboard looked uncertain. The man with the drill shrugged. They made a call. Then they got back in the van and drove off. For a moment, Adam allowed himself a breath of relief. But he knew this wasn't over. The move had been a test. A soft probe to see if he would back down once tools were in sight. They wouldn't risk liability on day one. Not with permits staring them in the face, but the notice had said the removal would happen, which meant the board, Karen, had another route planned. Not physical, not yet. Bureaucratic. That evening, a new email arrived from the neighborhood account. The subject line read, Notice of Rule Amendment, Facade Guidelines and Accessibility Structures. The attached PDF was 8 pages of language that, at a glance, sounded reasonable. The terms were framed as community-driven, forward-thinking. Words like balance, cohesion, and neighborhood character repeated like mantras. But buried in paragraph 6 was the clause. Any accessibility-oriented structural addition visible from the street must be approved by the Visual Standards Committee, regardless of municipal permitting. It was retroactive, effective immediately. Adam stared at the screen, jaw tight. He knew the strategy. They were rewriting the rulebook mid-game, counting on most residents to ignore it or assume it didn't apply to them. No city official would intervene unless forced to, and since the neighborhood council wasn't a government body, their overreach wouldn't trigger a state violation, unless someone formally challenged it. That would take weeks, maybe months. In the meantime, they could start applying fines or claim non-compliance at their discretion. The ramp wasn't just non-conforming. It was now a symbol, a test of their power. 2 days later, his mailbox held an envelope marked First Fine Warning. Inside, a form letter listed a violation fee of $100 per day, beginning retroactively from the date of the first notice. The total owed, so far, was $600. No signature, no phone number, just a P.O. box return address and a generic email. The paper was thick, expensive, professionally printed. This wasn't amateur hour, it was coordinated. He considered paying, just once, just to reset the conflict. But the thought made him feel sick. It wasn't about money, it was about precedent. Pay once, and they'd own the narrative. Refuse, and he'd have to prepare for escalation. That same afternoon, he took a walk around the block, less for exercise and more to feel the texture of the neighborhood now that the war had gone silent. He nodded to neighbors he recognized but got only tight smiles in return. A few turned away. Others paused their conversations as he passed. This wasn't paranoia. It was a shift in posture. People were watching, weighing him against the pressure they felt. Karen had been working overtime, no doubt. He passed by her house without stopping. It was easy to identify now. The pristine hedges, the matching shutters, the American flag precisely centered on the porch. Her car, an immaculately polished black sedan, sat perfectly aligned in the driveway. The kind of order that didn't bend, only broke. As if on cue, she appeared on her front step with a mug in hand. She didn't wave, just watched. Her smile was pleasant, rehearsed. But behind it, Adam saw calculation. Karen wasn't just a bored neighbor with too much time. She was political, strategic. She was building a narrative, and he was the villain in it. That night, Adam filed a complaint with the city's Office of Disability Rights, documenting the fines and attaching evidence of the ramp's necessity and prior approval. He also contacted the planning department, requesting confirmation in writing that no neighborhood association could override city permits on ADA-compliant modifications. The response was prompt but non-committal. We acknowledge receipt of your concern. Please be advised that property associations may enforce internal visual standards, provided no physical removal is attempted without appropriate legal process. In other words, they couldn't stop him, but they wouldn't help him either. The following morning, he found his trash bins overturned. Not scattered, just tipped neatly onto their sides. Enough to be annoying, but not enough to warrant a police report. A week later, his internet connection started cutting out between 9 a.m. and noon, the exact window in which he'd scheduled his correspondence and research. His ISP insisted it was network maintenance. Coincidence, maybe, but Adam had designed smart city networks before. He knew how easy it was to reroute or throttle access through local nodes if someone with authority made a request. The subtle harassment was escalating, never direct, always deniable. One morning, a small yellow flag appeared on the edge of his lawn. Surveyor's tape, like the kind used before utility work. No notice had been issued. He called the number listed on the tag and was told no work had been scheduled on his property. 2 days later, the flag was gone. A phantom marker. A message. He started documenting everything. Not out of paranoia, but discipline. He created a private logbook with timestamps, screenshots, voice memos, mail scans. Every interaction, every deviation from normalcy. Because he understood systems, and systems left fingerprints. The people behind them thought they were being careful, but they weren't thinking like engineers. They were thinking like administrators, linear, reactive. He could use that. Still, he knew he couldn't fight this alone, not indefinitely. So he began reaching out, not to journalists or social media, but to professionals. A friend at a private ADA consultancy gave him the number of a former federal compliance officer now working freelance. She agreed to review his case. Her first reaction was telling. "They're testing you. They think you won't escalate because you're reasonable. You need to decide if you're going to stay that way." Adam didn't answer immediately, not because he was unsure, but because he was calculating what came next. Adam had always believed in proportional response. There was no virtue, in his mind, in becoming theatrical over minor provocations. But what was happening wasn't minor. The paper trail of fines continued to grow, each notice arriving with slightly more formal language, typed on heavier paper, bearing more aggressive terms like willful defiance and compounding noncompliance. It was absurd, but it wasn't harmless. This was how pressure was applied in polite society, not with fists, but with fees, form letters, and the slow erosion of legal standing. Each envelope was a strategic incision into his credibility, his patience, his position as a neighbor rather than an adversary. The association had chosen the slow bleed. So Adam escalated. He didn't start with confrontation. He started with information. He submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the Municipal Archive for all registered modifications to zoning designations in his neighborhood over the last 5 years. Then he dug into the bylaws of the local property council, not the glossy pamphlet they distributed to new residents, but the actual binding charter filed with the city. He found 3 contradictions between their stated authority and the parameters allowed by the city's neighborhood governance statute. It wouldn't win him the war, but it gave him ammunition. He retained the ADA consultant. Her name was Eliza Reed, and she moved with the precision of someone who had built her career in bureaucracy and knew exactly which thread to pull to get a department to blink. She reviewed his case, then submitted an official inquiry to the Department of Civil Compliance on his behalf. It wasn't a lawsuit, not yet, but it was a warning flare. A demand for clarification regarding the treatment of medically necessary modifications in areas governed by non-governmental associations. It forced the city to reply, and once they replied, they were on record. Meanwhile, Adam met with an attorney, not a high-profile litigator, just a quiet man named Crenshaw, who had spent 20 years handling zoning conflicts and code enforcement disputes. Crenshaw was unimpressed by the association's maneuvering. "They're paper tigers," he said, "but they win because people let the paper pile up until it buries them." He drafted a cease and desist letter addressed to the board, stating plainly that any further attempts to collect fines, interfere with the ramp, or issue threats of removal would be treated as unlawful harassment under state disability statutes. He copied the city attorney, the Office of Neighborhood Affairs, and the local ombudsman. It was a bureaucratic flare barrage, one that didn't declare war, but made it clear Adam wasn't retreating. But the pushback wasn't just legal. It became visceral. 2 nights after the letter went out, someone tossed a bag of cement mix onto his ramp. Not enough to cause damage, but enough to create mess and friction. The powder settled into the grooves, hardening in streaks that took hours to scrub off. Adam didn't file a report. There was nothing to prove. No cameras had caught it, no witnesses. But he logged it. Eliza noted it too. "This isn't about rules anymore," she said. "This is about reminding you they're watching. You're being isolated." She was right. The silence in the neighborhood had thickened. Before, it had been ambivalence. Now, it was avoidance. People no longer nodded as he walked past. Conversations died when he stepped onto the sidewalk. Delivery drivers hesitated longer at his gate. even children who used to ride scooters past his porch now took the longer loop around the opposite side of the cul-de-sac. It wasn't overt hostility, but it was active distance. Karen's influence was growing, and she was shaping the story. Then came the incident with the contractor. A white pickup truck parked directly in front of his house one afternoon, engine idling for nearly 20 minutes. The man inside wore a neon vest and sunglasses. He didn't get out. Adam watched from the living room, noting the behavior. Too long to be waiting for someone. Too still to be mapping or checking a job order. Eventually, the man pulled away. But the next morning, Adam woke to find a bright green spray paint X on the sidewalk in front of his driveway, normally used to mark utility lines or excavation points. When he called the city works department, they confirmed no work had been scheduled on his property. The flag from last week made sense now. Someone was staging the illusion of legitimacy. They wanted him to believe something was being prepared, or that something would happen and it would all seem official. Crenshaw was less amused. "This is coordinated," he said. "You're not dealing with disorganization. You're dealing with someone trying to manufacture enough confusion to provoke you into doing something that can be used against you." Adam didn't take the bait. He removed the mark, documented it, and said nothing publicly. But he began reinforcing his perimeter, not physically but in terms of narrative. He drafted a summary report of the harassment incidents, including the cement, the markings, and the staged vehicle, and submitted it to the Office of Civil Conduct with a request to open a formal investigation. Then he reached out quietly to two former colleagues still working in city infrastructure management and shared what was happening, not in dramatic terms, but as a case study. One of them, a municipal risk auditor named Owen, agreed to pull internal records on permits issued to the neighborhood association in the past year. The results were revealing. The association had submitted applications for several visual enhancement projects, including one that specifically referenced elevated entry modifications on multiple properties, none of which were ADA compliant. The language mirrored the language in the letters Adam had received. It suggested Karen and her board were testing policies on select properties to establish precedent before pushing broader changes. They were using Adam as their first case, a test subject. Crenshaw called it what it was: entrapment by policy. "They want to provoke a reaction," he said. "If you remove the ramp, you validate their authority. If you lash out, they cite your aggression. If you sue, they stall and claim neutrality. The only way to beat this is to force external recognition that they're exceeding their scope." Eliza agreed, and she had an idea. "There's a mechanism in the state code for accessibility grievance arbitration," she said. "It's underused, but it allows a neutral state-appointed investigator to review claims without going through a lawsuit." She filed the paperwork that week. The process would take a few weeks, but once active, it would block any local actions until a ruling was made. The board didn't like that. Within days, Adam received a new letter. Not a fine this time, but a final notice of review. It stated that due to continued refusal to comply with neighborhood aesthetic adjustments, his property would be subject to mandatory visual assessment, and that failure to allow access for this review would result in penalties under the Community Obstruction Clause. The clause didn't exist in any legal document Adam had seen. He read the letter twice. Then, a third time. It was a bluff, but it was a dangerous one, meant to invoke fear. He responded in kind. His reply, vetted by Crenshaw, cited the pending state arbitration, reminded the board of legal protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and issued formal notice that any unauthorized entry onto his property would constitute trespass. He copied every name on the letter to the state arbitration office and Eliza. For 2 days, silence. Then came the knock at the door. It was Karen. No clipboard this time, no smile either. Just her and that dog, Muffin, panting in the summer heat. She asked if he had a moment. He didn't answer immediately, but after a pause, stepped outside. She didn't waste time. "You've made this more complicated than it needed to be," she said. "No one wants a scene. No one wants legal back and forth. But when someone refuses to respect the tone of the neighborhood, it forces our hand." Adam replied calmly. "The tone of the neighborhood doesn't override law." Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. "It's not about law. It's about respect, about cohesion. You've decided your personal situation is more important than the balance we've created here, and that's unfortunate." Adam looked at her dog, then back at her. "Your board's balance is illegal, and it's being reviewed." She smiled faintly. "Let's hope you're happy with what that brings." Then she walked away. Adam stood on the porch for a long time after she left. Not angry, not even rattled, just certain that the next phase would be uglier and more deliberate. Adam had always believed that systems eventually expose themselves, not through dramatic reveals or sudden collapses, but through inconsistencies, patterns, and the quiet arrogance of those who believe themselves unaccountable. The exchange with Karen hadn't surprised him, but it confirmed what he had suspected all along. This wasn't about aesthetics. It wasn't even about the ramp. It was about control, manufactured, asserted, and protected through a web of policies that were only loosely tethered to legality. What unsettled Adam wasn't the hostility. It was the confidence. Karen didn't speak like someone who feared being challenged. She spoke like someone who already knew the outcome. That kind of confidence only came from one of two things: ignorance or backing. Adam didn't think she was ignorant. The next morning, Adam received a brief email from Eliza. The state had formally accepted the arbitration request. An investigator would be assigned within 5 business days, and once assigned, the neighborhood board would be legally prohibited from enforcing any action related to the ramp until the review was complete. It was a small victory, procedural, not symbolic, but it gave him breathing room. He forwarded the confirmation to Crenshaw, who replied simply, "Now, let's see what they do when they can't touch you." Adam wasn't optimistic. Power didn't retreat. It rerouted. He was right. 2 days later, a new campaign began, not through official letters but through suggestion and implication. A neighbor, 2 houses down, an elderly man named Rhodes, who Adam had spoken to a handful of times about landscaping, approached him on the sidewalk with an apologetic look. "Just so you know," Rhodes said, "they've started talking about safety audits, saying that maybe your front walk's a liability, that someone could trip and sue." Adam didn't flinch, but he felt the heat rise behind his eyes. The ramp, designed specifically to reduce injury, was now being weaponized as a hazard. It was irrational, but effective. Fear, Adam knew, didn't require logic, only repetition. He thanked Rhodes, then spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing old project files from his time designing this district. While doing so, he stumbled across something he'd long forgotten: a supplemental infrastructure proposal from the city's transit authority, never executed, that included underground conduit tunnels running beneath the western edge of the neighborhood. The area, at the time, had been considered for a light rail utility corridor that was eventually abandoned for budgetary reasons. The tunnels were never demolished, just sealed and buried. He remembered this because he had personally reviewed the drainage overlays that redirected runoff through those unused tunnels to relieve surface strain. He dug deeper, checking current satellite imagery against old survey maps. The lines hadn't changed, which meant those tunnels, dry, buried, and inaccessible to the public, still existed. One of them passed directly beneath Karen's property. The realization didn't present a solution, but it stirred something else in him. Perspective. He had designed networks to withstand pressure, redundancy, unexpected rerouting. Karen, for all her posturing, had no idea she was standing on forgotten infrastructure. That irony wasn't just satisfying, it was instructive. Systems outlive their designers, and the arrogance of those who inherit control often leads them to mistake temporary authority for permanence. He wasn't going to lecture her. He wasn't going to argue. He was going to treat her like a failed node in a system. Isolate, document, reroute. The state investigator contacted him the next morning. Her name was Lydia Mantle, and her voice was calm but firm. She had reviewed the case file and was scheduling on-site visits for all parties. The board would be notified by certified mail, and once notice was served, any retaliation or interference would constitute obstruction. Adam asked her plainly how often these kinds of disputes were resolved in favor of homeowners. She replied without hesitation, "When the homeowner documents everything and keeps calm, more than you'd think." He thanked her and spent the next 2 days preparing a comprehensive binder, printed, labeled, and organized chronologically, with every communication, photo, and piece of documentation since the conflict began. It wasn't for dramatic effect. It was protocol. On the day Lydia arrived, Karen was outside clipping her hedges. She glanced up when the investigator's car pulled into Adam's driveway, and though she didn't wave, her posture changed, straightened, tight. Adam met Lydia at the door. She was efficient, no small talk. She inspected the ramp, reviewed the permit, took photos, measured incline and materials, then asked about the frequency and nature of the board's communications. Adam answered factually, without editorializing. He didn't speculate. He presented evidence. She asked for access to any physical copies of warnings or fines. He handed her the binder. After 45 minutes, she closed it. "This isn't going to be easy," she said, "but you've done your homework, and from what I can see, your rights are being compromised under the guise of procedural authority." Adam didn't smile. He didn't need to. She was saying what he already knew, but now it was being said by someone outside the neighborhood, and on record. Later that evening, he noticed something strange. A pickup truck with a private security firm's logo parked across the street, engine running. Not a city vehicle, not law enforcement. It didn't approach. It didn't move. Just sat there until the sun dipped low. Then it was gone. No interaction, just presence. A shadow on the edge of the field. Adam didn't confront it. He logged the time, took a picture, and forwarded it to Crenshaw and Eliza. Eliza's reply came fast. "They're nervous." "That's a good sign, but be careful. Visibility is protection." For the first time since the conflict began, Adam felt something shift. Not in his favor entirely, but away from their control. The board, so confident and rehearsed, was reacting now. Improvising. It was clumsy, almost obvious. They'd expected silence, maybe a tired compromise. Not escalation, not structure, not someone who matched them procedure for procedure, word for word. He sat on his porch late into the night, eyes on the street, ramp beneath him, waiting, not for confrontation, but for acknowledgement that the midpoint had passed, and what followed wouldn't be a negotiation. The silence after Lydia's visit was brief, almost performative. For 2 full days, no new letters arrived, no flags appeared, no suspicious vehicles idled across the street. It was as if the neighborhood had exhaled, holding its breath in anticipation of what might come from the state arbitration process. But Adam knew better than to mistake stillness for retreat. Pressure had simply shifted form. He saw it in the subtle reconfigurations of social architecture, the way neighbors began parking farther from his curb, how the community bulletin board at the local park suddenly featured flyers promoting a neighborhood revitalization project, led by Karen Belrose and her subcommittee, using language so innocuous it was practically weaponized. Phrases like restoring harmony, preserving visual identity, and guarding the character of our homes. It was a soft campaign, an appeal to collective memory, trying to frame Adam's insistence on accessibility as an act of aggression against beauty. He kept to himself more now, but not out of fear, out of efficiency. His time was spent reinforcing the integrity of his case. He upgraded his property camera system, replacing older motion detectors with thermal imaging sensors and securing the feeds with encrypted backups. It wasn't paranoia, it was protocol. He filed an official incident report with the city documenting the previous vehicle surveillance and requested a notice of inquiry into the licensing of private security activity within his neighborhood. Eliza approved the move. Paper trails worked both ways. Then, without warning, the water shut off. It happened mid-afternoon on a Wednesday, with no notice and no prior indication of scheduled work. Adam had been in the middle of preparing documents for Lydia's second visit when the pipes hissed dry. At first, he assumed a city issue, old infrastructure, maybe a valve inspection. But the neighbors still had pressure. He confirmed it by watching sprinklers burst from the yards 2 doors down while his own faucets sputtered air. He checked the main valve box near the curb and found the cap cracked open. The shutoff lever had been turned manually. It was a subtle, simple act, but deliberate. When he called the water department, they confirmed no outages were listed in his area and had no record of work orders. Adam didn't call the police. He documented it, took photos, logged the timestamps, and forwarded everything to Eliza and Crenshaw. It wasn't about damage. It was about signaling. That night, another car appeared. This one didn't stay long, only 10 minutes, but the headlights remained on, aimed directly at his living room windows. Not bright enough to provoke a call, but intrusive enough to be felt. When Adam stepped onto the porch, the car drove away without pause. He didn't follow. He just logged it, same as before. Eliza called him the next morning, her voice low but composed. "They're probing for a response," she said. "The idea isn't to intimidate you into confrontation. It's to make you unstable. If they can frame you as volatile, the arbitration tilts." Adam nodded silently, pacing the length of his ramp as she spoke. He understood tactics. He had written response models for urban infrastructure sabotage simulations. But understanding didn't make it easier to live through. Lydia returned 2 days later. Her demeanor hadn't changed. She was as precise and detached as before, but there was a note of deeper concern in her tone when she reviewed the escalation log Adam had assembled. "You've done everything right," she said. "But if they don't believe you're willing to escalate legally, they'll keep testing thresholds." Adam didn't respond. He didn't need to. He handed her a sealed envelope. Inside was a copy of Crenshaw's prepared lawsuit draft, including names, dates, violations of disability rights codes, and a formal damages claim. He hadn't filed it yet. but he wanted her to know it existed. The tension shifted again after Lydia's second visit. Karen no longer walked past his house during her morning rounds. The community board at the park now displayed a new notice. Petition to reinforce visual ordinances. Signatures welcome. The wording was vague, but the implication wasn't. They were going to try to codify retroactive authority. They couldn't remove the ramp now, but if they could force a community vote that labeled his structure as non-compliant, regardless of permitting, they might generate enough procedural fog to stall or reverse any future protections granted by the arbitration ruling. It was a long shot. But Adam didn't underestimate desperation. Then came the drone. He first noticed it hovering briefly above his backyard. Silent, low-flying, standard quad configuration with a mounted camera. It didn't linger, just passed over slowly, tilted, and disappeared beyond the tree line. He wasn't sure who it belonged to, but the next day, a screenshot arrived anonymously in his email. An aerial view of his ramp, with the caption, "Eyesore." No sender, no metadata. He traced the email to a generic domain hosting service in Nevada. Untraceable. He didn't reply. Instead, he installed a signal jammer near the rear gutter, legal within the parameters of personal drone shielding under municipal airspace policy. If they wanted to film his property, they'd have to do it the old-fashioned way. Crenshaw submitted an inquiry on Adams' behalf to the state's Privacy Commission, citing targeted aerial surveillance without consent. The filing alone was enough to trigger a warning sent to local associations about drone use on private property. It didn't matter if it was enforceable. It mattered that it created risk. The board responded by accelerating their public pressure strategy. A printed newsletter began circulating, unsigned but clearly produced through the same formatting software Karen's prior mailings had used. It accused unnamed residents of undermining neighborhood cohesion through unilateral architectural modifications and aggressive legal posturing. It didn't name Adam, but it didn't need to. The implication was surgical. It reframed him not as a man defending accessibility, but as a litigant disrupting peace. He was now the aggressor, the lawsuit threat, the outsider with bureaucrats in his corner and no regard for community dialogue. Adam's inbox began filling with anonymous complaints, strange, formulaic, clearly scripted emails accusing him of exploiting city resources and abusing disability codes for personal comfort. Some were absurdly detailed, referencing medical terminology with unsettling specificity. He had no way to prove who wrote them, but Crenshaw flagged the language as likely drafted or revised by someone with legal training. The harassment had evolved from vandalism to reputational warfare. That weekend, someone dumped a pile of gravel across the base of his ramp. Not enough to block access entirely, but enough to force a climb or risk a slip. There was no witness, no camera footage. But Adam saw tire tracks, wide and fresh, cutting across the lawn from the side alley. He filed a police report this time. The officer who arrived was courteous but non-committal. Without footage or eyewitnesses, it'll be marked as vandalism, no suspect. You might want to consider lighting. He already had lighting, motion-triggered, flood level, but it hadn't activated. The power circuit feeding it had been cut, clean, precise, as if snipped with electrician's tools. He hired a licensed tech the next morning to repair it. The man confirmed the severed wiring and offered to reroute the system through an underground conduit directly to the main breaker panel, bypassing the exposed external junction. Adam agreed. It was the first time he'd felt truly targeted. Eliza called that night. She didn't try to soften it. "This is tactical escalation," she said. "They've moved from pressure to sabotage. That's admissible evidence now. We're compiling the full timeline for the arbitration officer." Adam asked her one question. "Is this how it usually ends?" There was a pause. "Usually they win because people fold. But you haven't folded. So now they're escalating fast and sloppy. That means they're scared." The next morning, Lydia returned. She wasn't alone. She was accompanied by a second official, a man named Daniel from the state ADA Enforcement Bureau. They conducted a full reinspection, reviewed photos of the gravel incident, the cut wiring, the drone screenshots. Daniel was blunt. "This is retaliation," he said, "and it qualifies as obstruction of a protected accommodation." Karen and any board member who signed off on the enforcement letters would now be subject to direct state inquiry. The dynamic had shifted. Adam didn't celebrate. He didn't make speeches or post about it online. He simply swept the gravel from the base of the ramp and watched the second car leave. By the time Daniel's formal report had been logged into the state system, the tone of everything changed. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't visible to those who weren't paying attention, but Adam noticed it in the shift of momentum, the tempo of replies, the sudden absence of newsletters, the fact that Karen didn't appear on her porch for 3 days in a row. The silence, this time, was weightier, laced with the tension of delay rather than defiance. The board hadn't retreated. They had gone into containment mode. Somewhere, someone was trying to slow things down, negotiate quietly, bury paperwork under administrative misdirection. But the arbitration clock was running, and the state inquiry now had names attached, with Daniel's findings pushing the situation into a category no neighborhood committee was built to handle: state-level ADA retaliation liability. That came with real consequences, not just fines, but injunctions, audits, even personal penalties. The stakes were no longer limited to Adams' ramp. They were institutional. Crenshaw moved fast. He sent formal notice to the association through certified mail, citing the preliminary findings of harassment and unauthorized interference with accessibility accommodations. The letter was clinical, brutal in its simplicity. It laid out the threat of personal lawsuits against any board member who had signed off on punitive action after Adams' medical exemption had been filed. It reminded them that insurance often didn't cover intentional misconduct. It ended with a demand: immediate and permanent cessation of any correspondence, enforcement, or penalties relating to the ramp, and a formal apology to be issued in writing. There was no bluff, just pressure. Adam didn't want the apology. He didn't care for it. What he wanted was for the machine they'd built, the petty empire of compliance they wielded like a social weapon, to collapse under its own arrogance. And for the first time, he saw cracks. An anonymous email arrived in his inbox from an address that appeared nowhere in the earlier correspondence. It was short, unsigned. Karen acted alone. Most of us didn't know the full extent. We're sorry, this got out of hand. It wasn't a confession, not enough to stand in court, but it was validation. Someone on the inside had seen the line get crossed and now wanted distance from the fallout. Adam didn't reply. That same evening, a city inspector visited unannounced. Not for the ramp, but for the sidewalk in front of Karen's property. Apparently, someone had submitted a complaint about overgrowth from her ornamental vines creating a trip hazard. Adam hadn't submitted it. He didn't need to. Systems, once activated, ripple outward. And when scrutiny is applied to one link in the chain, others are exposed. The inspector took photos, issued a citation, and left. Karen stood in her yard watching, not protesting, just standing, her posture stiff, arms folded across her chest, her mouth set in a tight line. The same stance she'd once used to address Adam's property now pointed inward. The enforcement spotlight had turned. But the board wasn't done yet. Not entirely. Desperation has its own energy, and they used what little remained to try a final maneuver. They called for an emergency community vote to amend the association's bylaws, aimed at introducing a new provision that would restrict visible non-conforming structures on all lots, including those previously grandfathered in. It was a Hail Mary, built on ambiguity, and its language was intentionally convoluted, enough to confuse uninformed voters into believing it had something to do with general beautification or neighborhood unity. Flyers were passed around. Door-knocking resumed. The ramp wasn't named, but the subtext was clear. Adam didn't counter it with more flyers. He didn't go door to door. Instead, he prepared a presentation, 10 minutes, straight facts, and requested to speak at the vote meeting, held in the community center on the edge of the neighborhood. He brought his binder. He brought copies of Lydia and Daniel's reports. And when the evening came, he showed up early, took a chair in the back, and waited. The room filled slowly, more than he expected. Some faces he recognized, others he didn't. Karen stood at the front with her usual poise, but even she looked different now. Thinner, somehow. Not in body, but in authority. Her words, when she began to speak, lacked their former certainty. She talked about cohesion, about visual responsibility, about how neighborhoods needed consistency to retain value and pride. But there was a tremor beneath the surface, a hesitation she couldn't fully conceal. Then Adam was called. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't show anger. He simply recited the chain of events, the documentation, the legal findings, the fact that the proposed vote contradicted state and federal protections. He explained the consequences, not just for him, but for the board, for the association, for every resident whose dues would be diverted to pay legal costs in a losing battle. Then he ended with a single sentence that silenced the room. This neighborhood exists on a foundation I helped design, in more ways than one, and I refuse to be told I don't belong here because my ramp doesn't match your planters. No one clapped. There was no outburst, just a stillness. Karen did not respond. The vote was held. The measure failed, narrowly but decisively, and with that the final offensive collapsed. The bylaws remained unchanged. The ramp remained untouched. And Karen left the meeting early, her dog trailing behind, not looking back. 2 days later, a formal notice arrived in Adam's mailbox. The board was stepping down, Karen included. The message was brief, citing a need for leadership transition and new voices for a changing community. It didn't name him. It didn't need to. He kept the letter but didn't frame it. He didn't speak of it to anyone. That night, for the first time in weeks, the sky above his yard was quiet. No drones, no headlights, no motion. But the ramp remained, and Adam walked it twice before bed. Not as an act of defiance, but as a reminder that permanence wasn't measured in silence, but in the refusal to yield. The ramp stayed. That was the most obvious fact. Not just because it had survived legal scrutiny and bureaucratic retaliation, but because no one dared touch it now. It sat there, unchanged, exactly as Adam had built it, as practical and unremarkable as the day he'd laid its first bolts. What had once been framed as a violation, a stain on the neighborhood's facade, had quietly faded into the landscape. It was no longer a topic of discussion, no longer a symbol of defiance or threat. It had simply become part of the street. And in that, Adam found a strange kind of victory, one not marked by fanfare or celebration, but by stillness, by the slow reclamation of peace through persistence. Karen moved out. Not right away, not in disgrace, but quietly, in the way people do when they've exhausted their influence and no longer find the echo they expect in others. A "For Sale" sign appeared on her lawn less than a month after the vote, and her car was gone a week after that. No announcements, no farewells. The house sat vacant for a while, its roses wilting, hedges slightly overgrown, as if the property itself had exhaled. Eventually, new owners moved in, a family with 2 kids and a German shepherd that barked at squirrels and occasionally at shadows, but never at Adam. He met them once, briefly. They waved, he waved back. That was enough. The board reorganized under new leadership. Younger, more cautious, and far more interested in managing common landscaping than architectural conformity. Adam received a letter inviting him to attend the next meeting, to share input as a respected long-term resident. He declined, not out of spite, but because he didn't need to sit at the table to know the menu had changed. He'd made his point. Let others handle the decorum. Eliza closed the arbitration with a final summary that landed firmly in Adam's favor. The ramp was declared untouchable, a protected modification under both city and state statutes. The report included recommendations for policy reform across residential councils statewide, language Adam had suggested himself, written not for vengeance but for replication, a blueprint for others who might one day find themselves in a similar fight without the same resources or training. Lydia sent a thank-you note, handwritten, short but sincere. Crenshaw filed the paperwork to dismiss the pending civil suit, citing complete and voluntary compliance with demanded protections. He refused to take Adam's money beyond the hours worked, saying simply, "You were the most prepared client I've had in years." That was payment enough. And Adam? He didn't become a symbol. He didn't write an article or give an interview or record a video explaining how he'd stood up to them and won. That wasn't his nature. He returned to routine, to habit, to maintenance and slow, steady repairs. He updated his rainwater collection system, remulched the flower beds, replaced a cracked pane in the garage window that had been broken long before any of this had started. The damage, such as it was, had never been physical. It had been structural, an attempt to unmake a man not by violence but by revision, to render him an exception, a disruption in someone else's narrative of order. But the story was his now. Not because he had imposed it, but because he had refused to be edited out of it. Sometimes at night he still walked the ramp twice, not because he needed to test it, but because he understood what it cost to keep it. It was no longer just a structure. It was a line in the ground, a boundary drawn not to keep others out, but to remind them where erosion stopped and resistance began. And in the quiet that followed, the neighborhood softened. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, in the way places do when the illusion of control dissolves, and people begin to remember that strength and compliance are not the same thing. No one ever thanked him directly. They didn't need to. He had built this place once, from the ground up, and when they forgot, he reminded them. That was enough.